one of the Tocqueville Center's November event. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the interim director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. The Tocqueville Center is dedicated to exploring the big questions asked by the best minds in the Western tradition. Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century French aristocrat, social scientist, philosopher, and politician, is one of those great minds. His classic book, Democracy in America, is still relevant for those of us dedicated to preserving democracy in North America. This year, the Tocqueville Center is honoring the legacy of its namesake by focusing on topics in which Tocqueville was particularly interested. This month, we are examining the Black experience in America, which Tocqueville had much to say about in his book written 30 years before the end of slavery. As he looked on the America of the 1830s, he could see in the distance the elimination of slavery, but he could also see the pernicious effects of racialized servitude. He wrote perceptively, quote, "The law can abolish servitude, but only God can obliterate its traces. I see that slavery is in retreat, but the prejudice from which it arose is immovable. We live in an America where slavery's traces are still visible. That is what we wish to explore these 2 days." But before I introduce the speakers for the evening, let me first draw your attention to Furman's Standards of Comportment, printed right there, and I'm not going to read them, unlike usual. Now to the main event. Khari Brown is professor of sociology at Wayne State University. He earned a BA from Wayne State and an M.S.W. and Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. The badgers in the room are all hissing right now. His most recent book is Race and the Power of Sermons on American Politics, which examines the impact of race on the relationship between religion and social justice attitudes and political activism in the United States. His new book project examines how race and faith impact congregational involvement in grassroots social justice activism, including environmental activism. Today, Professor Brown is speaking to us on the topic, My Thoughts on Being Black in America, from Richard Jackson to Khari Brown. After he speaks, then I will introduce the panel that will discuss his talk, and Teresa Cosby will be moderating that. So I'll be back in just a minute. Let's welcome Khari Brown. Oh, I grabbed it. I'm sorry. It's just out of habit.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here to your university and allowing me to just talk a bit about my thoughts on being Black in America, from Richard Jackson, my father-in-law, to Khari Brown, my daughter. Maybe we should add an R to that so it doesn't say Kyra, but it's too late now. It's too late now. That's the issue me and my wife should have handled a long time ago. It's too late now. On February 4th, 1965, Richard Jackson, my father-in-law, African-American and from Marion, Alabama, was 19. On that date, he, along with his brother, Jesse, the fellow church members, and other area Blacks, participated in a peaceful protest march for their right to vote. They began marching from Zion Methodist Church in Marion towards the Perry County Circuit Clerk, which stood only 2 blocks away. But before they arrived, local police sent them running in every direction but the clerk's office when they began chasing and beating whomever they could catch with their clubs. Now, fortunately, my father-in-law was too quick and he escaped unharmed, but his brother Jesse wasn't so lucky as the police clubbed him once before he could get away. Now, whenever Mr. Jackson and his brother joke about this, his brother usually asks him, "Why didn't you help me and come back? Why didn't you come back and help me?" To which Mr. Jackson would usually say, "How'd you let him catch you? You're supposed to be quicker than that." So that's an ongoing joke. But in all seriousness, Mr. Jackson and the other protesters weren't completely shocked by the police's brutality. Prior to that march, they had attended a series of church meetings where their pastor, as well as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and members of the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition Conference clearly explained that by participating, they risked getting arrested, getting beat, and they even risked their lives. Understanding these risks, Mr. Jackson told me that he and others were willing to die for their beliefs. Well, a few weeks later, on February 18th, at another voting rights demonstration in Marion, Jimmy Lee Jackson, no relation, a 26-year-old Vietnam veteran and deacon at his church, did die for his beliefs. At the demonstration, James Fowler, an Alabama state trooper, shot and killed Jimmy Lee as he defended his mother from policemen who were attacking her. Following Reverend King eulogizing Jimmy Lee, he and SCLC leaders organized the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. The march's aim was to draw public attention to the state repression of African Americans and to push Governor Wallace to support a voting rights bill that protected the constitutional rights of African Americans to vote. Like the Marion March, the Selma March began violently. On March 7th, 1965, euphemistically known as Bloody Sunday, the Alabama Highway Patrol beat marchers as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, so to begin the first stage of their march. Under the protection of the National Guard, the march ended on March 25th, 1965, at the steps of the Alabama Capitol building, with Governor Wallace refusing to meet with the demonstrators or consider their demands for a voting rights bill. Nonetheless, 6 months later, on August 6th, President Johnson signed into law the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which federally protected the rights of all citizens to vote. Now, by nearly every metric I can think of, Black life in our nation significantly improved following Mr. Jackson risking his life for the right to vote in Alabama and President Johnson signing the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In southern states like Alabama and here in South Carolina, Black voter turnout during presidential elections increased from 43% in 1964 to roughly 66% in 2012, when Barack Obama, our first president of African descent, was elected for a second term. As a whole, 2/3 of Blacks voted during the 2020 presidential elections. Over time, growing Black voter turnout rates, along with the greater willingness of whites to support Black candidates, contributed to Black congressional representation increasing more than eightfold between 1963, 2 years prior to the Voting Rights Act, to the beginning of Obama's second term in 2013. As you can see in this chart, in 1963, Blacks represented less than 1% of Congress. By 2013, they were nearly 8.5% of Congress. And today, African Americans are 11% of Congress. The greater representation of Blacks in Congress, along with the increased willingness of Congress as a whole to enforce civil rights reforms, undoubtedly contributed to Blacks having more opportunities to live fulfilling lives in the decades following the mid-1960s, in which our federal government passed civil rights reforms. So for example, In 1965, less than 1% of blacks occupied managerial and professional jobs. Today, 1 in 10 managers are African Americans, and my wife, Kendra, is one such data point here. She's the director of clinical affairs at the University of Michigan Hospital System, which is a major academic hospital, where she's tasked with ensuring the profitability of the hospital system. That's all I can tell you about what she does. If you want to know more about that, you're going to have to talk to her. She makes money for the University of Michigan Hospital System. These occupational gains predictably led to higher incomes for African Americans, like our family. We're doing pretty good. Between the mid-1960s to 2021, black net income increased by 14%, the largest income gain of all race groups. And at the same time, the black poverty rate was cut in half, going from 40% in 1965 to 19% in 2019. These and other socioeconomic improvements very likely contributed to blacks living healthier and longer lives. As the chart indicates, between 1975 and 2020, the black life expectancy rate increased from 61 years to 74, while narrowing the white-black life expectancy gap from 8 to 4 years. In short, life is better for African Americans today than it was when Mr. Jackson, my father-in-law, was a young man. And the vast majority of Americans, roughly 80% according to this 2014 CBS poll, recognize that this is the case, that life is better for African Americans now than it was during the mid-1960s. And about the same proportion of Americans believe that we as a nation are better because of the changes brought on by the Civil Rights Movement. Sounds great, right? That sounds good. Everything sounds rosy. Yeah, so, all right, okay. So given that, how are we to understand that African Americans are considerably more likely than others to believe that more needs to be done to improve their racial group's well-being? In a 2020 Associated Press NORC poll, roughly 4 in 10 whites believed that most of the goals of the Civil Rights Movement have been achieved, while less than half that proportion of African Americans, a little under 17%, share that view. And the same poll finds that blacks are considerably more likely than whites to believe that a lot more needs to be done to improve black access to quality education, good jobs, affordable housing, healthcare, and other social economic resources so that blacks may receive equal treatment in this nation. All over the U.S., this sentiment that our nation has not quite met the goals of the Civil Rights Movement is reflected in the work of faith-based and grassroots social movement organizations like Moses of Detroit. Moses stands for Metropolitan Organizing Strategy Enabling Strength. Moses and other faith-based community organizing firms are interested in increasing the political power of the working class and poor, of which blacks are overrepresented. So to push their local and statewide officials to support legislation aimed at addressing their concerns. These groups are also interested in linking the concerns of those on the social economic margins, particularly the black poor, to those living in more affluent and white communities and to the state as a whole. In doing so, these groups meet in religious congregations and increasingly over Zoom to identify community leaders and issues that community members care about. They also train leaders in lobbying techniques, so to push local and statewide elected officials to sponsor and co-sponsor legislation aimed at improving access to health care, increasing funding for public schools and job training, ending police brutality, and all other legislation aimed at increasing the quality of life of the poor and working class. Now, I got so wrapped up in teaching about these groups and studying these groups that I actually joined. I joined Moses. And you can't see me because I'm taking the picture here. But on May 24th of this year, I went to Lansing, our state capital, with a delegation from Moses. We went to meet our state legislators to discuss how we could build public support for a single-payer health care bill that 23 of our legislators are sponsoring and co-sponsoring. And I took my daughter, Kira, who was 6th grade at the time, with me. This is Richard Jackson's granddaughter. And she said, oh yeah, I want to go because I really care about single-payer health care. I'm like, come on, I know you'd want a day off of school. But it's cool, it's fine. I let it pass. She went with me, I had a travel companion, took my dad with me as well. He's the guy in the Wayne State hat right there. At any rate, across this nation, there are roughly 200 faith-based community organizing firms like Moses, and roughly 30% of clergy say they've had some involvement with these groups. Some involvement may mean attending one meeting or going to one action. That could be some involvement. If you look closely, the congregations and unions that are heavily active is probably not that much more than 1% that are at every meeting, at every action, trying to recruit others to participate. I mean, I can't. I've been trying to get a meeting with my pastor. It's not easy. But, okay. The question we're left with is this. Why do African Americans and those that stand in solidarity with them and those that stand in solidarity with the working class and the poor, why do they want more from this nation? And why are organizations like Moses mobilizing Americans to demand more? Well, in a word or a phrase, I'd say it's this issue of equality of opportunity. We, as humans, want to be treated equally. So we're able to attain what we believe we need and want. So the issue is that despite the amazing progress we've made on issues of racial equality, race inequities continue to persist in nearly all qualities of life, from incarceration to poverty and health, to health outcomes, to nearly all other quality of life metrics. Also, despite the fact that we are much less racially segregated than we were 60 years ago, it's still the case that roughly half of Americans live in racially segregated communities. And by that I mean roughly half of us would have to move from our current neighborhood to another neighborhood so that each neighborhood looks like the racial demographics of the metropolitan region as a whole. So in Metro Detroit, where I live, it's 70%. 70% of people would have to get up and move to another neighborhood so that each neighborhood has 15% of African Americans. 70% of people have to move for that to happen, where we would have true racial integration. This is meaningful because due to African Americans being poorer, the concentration and isolation of African Americans in certain towns or certain parts of towns leads to their communities having disproportionately high rates of concentrated poverty and related social problems like fewer youth rec programs in their town or part of town, having more lower performing schools in their town or part of town, having higher rates of street level crime, and all other poverty related social ills in their town or their part of town. So again, one reason why African Americans and those that stand in solidarity with them and advocacy organizations like Moses continue to demand more from this nation is that while race is not nearly as large a determining factor in one's life chances as it once was, it still plays a role. Now, one challenge that groups like Moses face in moving this nation towards racial equality is racial inequality itself. As I'm sure you can imagine, the fact that Moses disproportionately mobilizes the race group with the least amount of wealth and subsequently donates the least amount of money to political campaigns means that it's no walk in the park for Moses to schedule meetings with elected officials like our representative, Debbie Dingell. She's great. She's wonderful. But it's not easy for Consuelo Hardaway, the executive director, to schedule meetings with her for this reason, and let alone trying to influence how she and others legislate. The racially segregated nature of the neighborhoods in which these types of groups organize also does them no special favors when trying to convince the public and the legislators that issues like gun violence or police surveillance or inadequate funding for schools and job training and other social issues that disproportionately affect poor blacks, that these issues are not just poor black issues, but are issues that affect everyone. Despite these challenges, Moses is a faith-based organization. And so their leaders and their volunteers have a faith in a higher power that their work is meaningful and that they are acting in accordance with what they believe is God's will for their organization, the region in which they organize, and the nation. And so despite the fact that they are organizing a group that has a limited amount of political power, when you look at the world in which Richard Jackson came of age in the mid-1960s, and you compare it to the world in which Khari Brown is coming of age in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and is becoming increasingly politically aware, it leaves me hopeful. I'm hopeful that groups like Moses that are acting in the spirit of the civil rights movement will continue to mobilize and empower African Americans and those that stand in solidarity with them to raise the consciousness of the public and political leaders to support policies that improve the qualities of life for everyone. That's it. Thank you. Want me to take a...
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Well, why don't you just sit
Sure.
and let me invite the rest of the panelists up here. Teresa, you can come here. So you all make your way up here, and I will introduce our panelists to everyone. Yeah. In fact, you're first to be introduced here. So, Monica Bell is professor of law and counselor to the dean at Yale Law School and associate professor of sociology at Yale University. She was born and raised right here in Anderson, South Carolina, and attended Furman University, where she graduated in 2003. She won a Truman Scholarship, and you can see her picture on the other side on the big wall of honor out there. She won a scholarship and went on from Furman to earn her MS at University of College Dublin, her JD at Yale Law School, and her Ph.D. at Harvard University. Between law school and graduate school, Professor Bell clerked for the Honorable Cameron McGowan Curry of the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina and served as an Arthur Lyman Fellow at the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia, where her work focused largely on TANF legislation and child support regulation. Before joining the faculty at Yale, she was the Klimenko, I think that's Klimenko, something like that, fellow and lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. Professor Bell was the first black woman to serve as a tenure-track member of the Yale Law School junior faculty and is the second black woman to receive tenure there. Professor Bell's recent scholarship has focused on policing and legal estrangement, race and spatial injustice, law and poverty, and trust in legal authorities. In addition to publication in the most prestigious journals in her field, Professor Bell also pursued and has pursued a career as a public intellectual by writing for popular outlets such as Politico, Inquest, and the Washington Post. Andra Gillespie, in red here, is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. She earned a BA from the University of Virginia and an MA, MPhil, and PhD from Yale. She is the author or editor of 3 books: Race in the Obama Administration, The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark and Post-Racial America, and Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership. Professor Gillespie is also a prolific columnist. Her many opinion pieces have appeared in newspapers and other publications across the country. Ali Pinero, very end, is assistant professor of African American history in the Department of History at Furman University. He earned his BA at the University of Central Florida and his MA and Ph.D. at the University of Iowa. His research focuses on the intersectionality of race, gender, and class in the military from 1850 through the 1920s. He is author of the award-winning The Family, Civil War, Black Soldiers, and the Fight for Racial Justice, which highlights how racism in and outside of military service impacted the bodies, economies, family structures, and social spaces of African Americans long after the Civil War ended. And our moderator, Teresa Cosby, who is professor of politics and international affairs at Furman. She earned both her BA and JD at Howard University. Professor Cosby clerked for United States Magistrate Judge William M. Cato Jr. She served as an Assistant Deputy Attorney General for the South Carolina Attorney General's Office, was Executive Director of Legal Services of South Carolina and the former Legal Services of Western Carolina. She also served as the Executive Director of the Black Family Land Trust, where we dragged her away and made her professor at Furman University, a 6-state program. Let's welcome our panelists, and I'm turning this over.
So if you notice, Monica and I gave each other a little nod because Monica also worked at Legal Services of Western Carolina when she was a puppy. So welcome to you all. So when I was talking to Dr. Brown, he said he wanted this to be a conversation. And so we appreciate that and appreciate that format. But before we get to a conversation, the way this is set up is for each of you to kind of comment on Dr. Brown's presentation. And so I'm just going to go with the person that's closest to me now.
Okay.
Monica.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to focus my comments, instead of like talking about that now, I'm going to focus my comments on the talk, which I really, really enjoyed and appreciated. And I love the kind of arc of the family story blended with the history. I just think that's so important because these trajectories are so personal. I think I have like 3 main reactions. So one is like kind of starting with your positive arc, and well, actually no, I'm going to save that comment for last because it's a little negative and I'm a little but the positive note. I don't know if it's bad. It's bad for us, not bad. So you told this amazing story about the organization that you worked with, the faith-based organization, and it reminded me of a conversation I've been part of recently with a number of people who are kind of interested in doing organizing, particularly against mass incarceration, and thinking about the sustainability of organizing. And faith-based organizations have something that makes them sustainable in ways that a lot of organizations don't, which is shared values, not just about the outcome, but all these other things like mutual aid, like people support each other, help each other, whatever. This runs up against a demographic shift, though, including among the Black community regarding interest in organized faith in churches. And I'll say, as a queer Black person, a lot of faith-based Black organizations are difficult for me to be a part of. And we've had a kind of increasing recognition of this. And so I guess I'm curious what you think about how to recreate that capacity to have sustainable movements. And or maybe it's not possible, but to have sustainable movements that aren't oriented around a kind of conservative faith-based organization. Or maybe that is just necessary, but it's a question I have. The second.
You want to answer, or you want to?
Oh, I was going to do the 3.
Go for it.
I'm going to do the
Okay.
3. I'm going to do 3. I'm going to try to make it real quick. So the second question related to the story you're telling about segregation, which I care a lot about, and I've written a bit about segregation and how to think about what the goals are, right? So is the goal one which I felt was implicit in what you were saying, is the goal in integration. Like, is the ideal to just like have, you know, people spread about, you know, I'm thinking about this too because of where I live. So I live in New York City, I live in Brooklyn, I live in a really gentrified neighborhood. And I've justified it as me being, I'm just like, it's okay for me to be there because I'm black. Maybe no, not really because of the economic aspects of things. However, like, it's a very, like, you could look at the neighborhood and see it as integrated, but it's not economically integrated. It's like, you know, there are a lot of black people who live in conditions of poverty in the neighborhood. And a lot of the resources that are now there are not there for them. You think about policing. Policing is not, like, people don't understand policing to be for them, to protect them. It's instead to protect the new people from them. And there's an understanding of that. So how should we think about the goals of reducing segregation? And the final comment, and this is the one that I said was maybe like negative. So you told this beautiful story about the Voting Rights Act. And I just think it bears mentioning that, you know, I was thinking about too, like your father-in-law, like, you know, being in this position of danger related to activism. So much went into the passage of the Voting Rights Act, with one of the key aspects of it being Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which until 2013, required certain jurisdictions, including South Carolina, to have pre-clearance for changes in voting. What that meant is that there was a federal watchdog to make sure that things I saw often when I worked for the Democratic Party of South Carolina, which wasn't part of the Bible, but like, it's like, you know, the wild things that would happen that were about chilling the black vote in South Carolina, went like in my very recent lifetime, are shocking. And we no longer have those types of federal checks. And there's talk about, you know, possibly other aspects of the Voting Rights Act are at risk with the current Supreme Court. And so I appreciated your hopefulness, and I want to share it. But I don't know if I'm with you, and I hope you can encourage me to be as hopeful as you are. All right, I'll stop.
Well, I'm thankful that Khari went first. Provided a great example. It's going to be a tough act to follow, and there are going to be things that I won't talk about because you've already mentioned it. So that's great.
Yeah, it's great.
To sort of think about sort of the trajectory, I think it sets up sort of a discussion about why people still see the world differently when viewed through the lens of race. And there are things that you can even see where you can see progress, but you still see where the inequalities and the gaps are that actually sort of help to explain a lot of the things that I think people in many instances take for granted. And so, like, that's what I'm taking away from it as I'm thinking about, okay, so what am I going to talk about tomorrow? But I really appreciate it. And I appreciate sort of the story of the family arc, and also the idea that there's generational transmission that's going on there, that your daughter is seeing this and she's internalizing it in a very sophisticated way for somebody her age, I must say. And if we wonder how that's actually going to inform her activism later on, right? You can understand the activism that we see in young people today, right? And see how it's not just coming out of some vacuum, but it's actually been informed by generations of prior activism.
No, so I was just let me say. Sorry.
You just chill.
All right, well, firstly, like, I'm coming at this as a historian, but actually what you just said is perfect, because since my student can confirm, like, I've been really trying to drill in modern African American history, is like how important children have always been to these movements. And even going to the 19th century, Crystal Webster has written a phenomenal book about black children in New York City doing similar activities, going to the Brownies with Du Bois, as well as just like, to me, it's re-emphasizing its legacy, because what I pointed out was the March for Your Life. It was a young black girl, I think she was like, 8, and I vividly remember her saying, when I get to, like, I'm able to vote, I'm going to change this country. And I cried, if I'm being honest, because like I saw that she knows her history, right? Because I'm thinking of Project Confrontation, the intentionality of modern civil rights activists, understanding how important children are. As I always try to tell my students, it's not going to be our generation we're older that are going to change things. We've done that, and more obviously can be done. It's you, it's my child, and it's that next wave. So I love seeing that picture of the multi-generational, like, activism. I also was just curious, and it actually made me think too about housing. So I lived before here, I worked at Augusta University. Great school, but like the history of that area is absolutely horrible. And I say it is very racially segregated to this day. Richmond County is where black people live. And Columbia County, where I live, that's where the white people live. So even in my own neighborhood, I was the black guy in the neighborhood, which made me very uncomfortable. All the time in my neighborhood where I owned the home. And it was to see the trauma, because when I was teaching a class about the 1883 civil rights case and all these things, and I'm like, wait, Richmond County, yo, this is here. And it was so depressing for a student to say, we can still see the ramifications in the public education system there. And I get frustrated about the reality that's still happening. The only thing I wanted to ask was how your work might connect to the intersectionality of race, gender, and even ethnic discrimination as it relates to HOAs. And I only ask that because, like, once I decided, we as a couple decided to get a home, that opened up a whole new world of like, wait, what? Like the covenants and all that, and I've been trying to explain to my students, like, HOAs, if they're structured, and I say right poorly, they can do more damage than you even fathom. And so, like, you need to know what those covenants say.
I chair an HOA.
Okay, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them are.
So I'm going to let you write down these queries. I want to kind of tag in a little bit. I'm teaching a class right now called Pursuing Justice to Fight the Kill Jim Crow. And one of the articles we read in that class were about perceptions of the success of the civil rights movement. And so it was a quantitative study that kind of showed, like, if you were in the civil rights movement, you may not think we benefited a lot from the civil rights movement. And if you're a Gen Zer, which I now understand is being called the Trayvon generation, that because of kind of the trauma that you've been raised in, starting with Trayvon and policing and et cetera, that you may not see the civil rights movement as successful. And to kind of glom onto that, when Dr. Nelson introduced me, he mentioned that I used to run an organization called the Black Family Land Trust. And one of the kind of central components of that organization was black farm land loss, which was dramatic, and how that impacts black wealth, black stability, black perceptions of success in America. So if we could kind of dump all of this on you and kind of address these questions.
All right, these are all great questions that I talk to my folks all the time. So, this is good. I can talk to other people about this. So I'll just start with the demographic shifts in this nation. So the demographic shifts, the rise of the religious nuns is a real thing, particularly among young people. So I think the last survey I saw was like maybe 30% of Americans identify as not having a religious faith at all. And these are in public opinion surveys, so it could be higher than that. This is what people are willing to admit. So you have that issue, and that the non-attendance of Americans, and it includes African Americans as well, is driven by a number of factors that we don't have a complete handle on. Some have argued that, well, at least among mainline white Protestants, that their shift occurred in the civil rights and anti-war movement in the 1960s. The leadership was much more progressive, much further ahead on these issues than the congregants, and they lost them. More recently, scholars are arguing that conservative Protestant congregations are losing members because of their position on cultural issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, and those types of issues. So that, some speculate that is part of the weakening of religious attendance and affiliation in America. And then, of course, as we become wealthier and more highly educated, people are questioning what they have been taught when they're growing up as well, and challenging leadership and what they've than let's believe about what their faith entails. Those are broad demographic shifts that are occurring in the U.S. and have occurred in Europe as well. There's not really much. So I think, but the interesting thing though about what you see in these public opinion polls is that most people still say they have a belief in a higher power, but people are becoming increasingly skeptical of the institution of religion. So the way I think about it is that part of it could be an issue of branding. Like, what does it mean to be a person of faith? The dominant narrative that I hear on the TV, I don't watch TV anymore, but on the social media and radio, is the conservative lens of Christianity. But when you look at activists, people that are really active in these organizations, it is about roughly the same percent that are connected to these progressive religious organizations that are active in the conservative organizations as well. So I think part of it could possibly be an issue of branding. For example, groups like Moses, they are a faith-based organization, but it's a universalistic ideal of what religion means. So they are disproportionately Protestant, but they are open to all paths to what they would call getting close to ideals of truth, whatever that means for folks. So if you say that you care about human beings that can't afford water, fine. They're not turning anybody away. If you say that it's a problem that unarmed African Americans are being surveilled and brutalized, they're not concerned about your faith. If you are a person of faith and you believe these ideals, if you're not, you believe these ideals, they're open. For Moses, it's just the easiest way to go. I mean, there are some folks that are connected to organizations that makes it easy for them to tap into. That's why they've expanded to labor unions as well. That's becoming increasingly difficult as the experience declines in union membership. For Moses, it's this ideal, this philosophical or theological ideal that all people have value. And if you come to that position because of your belief in a higher power, a universal spirit, what have you, then they want you. If you come to that position by your own self-reflection, they want you. The issue is a long way to answer this question. We did a recent survey on this. Nobody knows they exist. So I did a survey of just people in Metro Detroit. Have you heard of Moses? 7% said yes. 80% said they agreed, though, with their goals. But most folks don't know that they are around. So I think that's an issue. It's an uphill battle because of demographic shifts. So there's that issue. And the issue of integration and racial segregation. It's key. I mean, no one wants to feel out of place. No one wants to feel discriminated against. Nobody wants their kids to be made fun of. Nobody wants that. But my point of reference is Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is like a magical place. It's very unique. It's very unique. But because I think what's unique about Ann Arbor is that it's in a university town, so you have a lot of progressive, open-minded thinking people that are there. And what happens in Ann Arbor is that they have, I don't know what percentage of affordable housing is, it might be 4%. It's not more than 4%. But if you work at the grocery store, if you work at the bookstore, if you work at a coffee shop, if you're a single parent, you still get to send your kid to Ann Arbor Public Schools. You still get to use the public transit system that works all the time. We still have stores that will hire people. The police, you don't have high levels of crime because you have opportunities for people to work and send kids to decent schools and be a network of people with resources. So, when I'm thinking about the problem with racial segregation, you contrast that to Detroit. If you're poor in Detroit, I think somebody did a study of my metropolitan area, looking at Ann Arbor, Michigan, versus the towns east of us, which is called Ypsilanti. And if you are African American in Ann Arbor, you live on average 10 years longer than in Ypsilanti with similar socioeconomic factors in place. And it's because of all the resources that surround you. Now, of course, that means nothing if you're being mistreated. so it's a huge catch-22. But I think, and I'll just stop talking in just a minute. But to me, the water issue comes to me because in Detroit, people are concerned that, well, Detroit is disproportionately African American and has disproportionately high levels of working class and poor people. And increasingly people are concerned that they can't afford the water. And so they're pushing the state legislature and the county governments to pass a bill that would connect how much the city and the county charge for water to their income. Part of the issue is that Detroit has older water infrastructure because they have less property taxes to take care of the water infrastructure. So because African Americans disproportionately live there, they are disproportionately confronted with this issue. And it's a cycle. You're poor, no property taxes, bad water infrastructure, they're charging you high rates so they can try to fix it. It's an issue. But if, I know it's a kind of an ideal world, but if you're poor or working class and African American in Ann Arbor, where you're connected to resources, then there's nothing that anyone's ever talked about actually. So groups like Moses, I think this is like kind of like the ideal, where you get to a point where folks are folks, just people are people, even though that's, you run into race-based capitalism, so that's of course a big obstacle that you're facing. So that's one way to answer that. I'm sorry. We'll get to the other stuff. I can keep going. But.
We have time.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's see. Oh yeah. We talked about the intergenerational transfer of political activism. What I did not realize until my wife and I have been married 18 years. But I did not realize that my father-in-law was involved in the civil rights movement until my son, for a class project, interviewed him when he was 8. He didn't like to talk about it. He didn't like to talk about it because it was traumatic. And he left a year after his participation because better jobs and safety. His brothers left, married in Alabama. He has a couple sisters that are still there. So I didn't realize that so many folks were involved that don't talk about it because of their experiences. So what I've done, my son did a project with him. My daughter, when she was 8, she did a project with him, and we talk about it. So they can connect the dots, and so they can recognize that, you are extremely fortunate to be here. Your life is very different from what your granddad went through, and to make them just aware of how fortunate they are for people that sacrificed. And that is informed the way I teach and what I study as well. I did feel really guilty about not being involved. This, for me, this is new. I got involved last May, first time. I've been on faculty at Wayne now for 18 years, and at year 17, that's when I said I should do something more than write another survey-based research paper. But I got to that position because of my granddad, my kids, and then just a little bit of self-reflection. So that's where I'm at.
So I'm going to follow up on some questions that were asked on
Sure.
the panel. So the Voting Rights Act and this kind of narrative, and I think Dr. Bell was talking about Shelby in 2013, and then there was a Brenovich case, I think it was 2022, which attacked Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so I noticed on your slide it did kind of stop at 2012.
Oh, yeah.
So do you want to talk about that?
Well, I mean, voter turnout in 2020 was 66%.
Yeah.
So I think the way I look at it, of course, there was a concerted effort to repress the African American vote.
Yeah.
but it may have backfired in terms of encouraging more African Americans to go out and vote and stay in long lines regardless of what it takes. I have my wife's family, just family in Texas, and they, in 2020, reported being in line for a couple hours, waiting to vote. And of course, yeah, right, yeah, right. There's stories in other, states as well, southern states as well, where people have that same experience. So I think it's a constant struggle to stay involved. And so I think, in 2020, I think that's what was reflected. I haven't seen any studies yet that interviewed people in terms of like what led them to go out and wait in line and what did they expect once they were out there. I'm not seeing that yet. But I can only speculate that part of what was driving it was this concern that they're trying to repress the vote. People sacrificed and went out there and waited for longer than it took.
I mean, I would say though,
Yeah.
when we look at, because turnout in 2016 and 2020 is lower according to CPS self-reported data. So you see these high water marks around Obama, and when you attribute that bump to it being Barack Obama, you have the opportunity to elect and re-elect the first Black president of the United States. It goes down. I don't want to discount the importance of, the significance of the possibility of voter suppression, but there are also other issues, lack of mobilization.
Oh.
Like Hillary Clinton, if she campaigned just a little bit harder in Detroit and in Philadelphia, this could have been a very different election. In those particular years, COVID, lack of interest in the candidates, like all of those factors also can be, something that depresses voter turnout. We still look at where Black and white voter turnout is compared to Latino and Asian voter turnout, right? There are huge differences. And that is almost entirely because of mobilization, because of this assumption that those folks aren't citizens. And so you make assumptions and you don't actually go ask them enough to go turn out and vote, which is actually, that problem happens with Blacks because they're all Democrats, so you don't ask them to go vote because you already know how they're gonna vote. And then with other groups, it's they're foreigners, which is also like a really terrible misconception that we really have to get over. In terms of thinking about it. I did have another question. Like I was looking at the map where you were talking about all of the Moses chapters.
Yes.
And it was interesting to see where it proliferated. What are the issue bundles of it? Is it like a Moses chapter the same in terms of the issues that they're advocating for across the country? Because I noticed that there was a chapter in western Montana, in eastern Washington, places that, there are some places that are that would be considered racially ethnically diverse, but not all of these places are. So are they all coordinated and talking about the same issues at the same time, or is there a lot of local autonomy in terms of what they do?
There's very local autonomy. It's very based upon what is happening in that area. So most of the issues are quality of life issues. Jobs, schools, public safety, public health, water affordability. Those are the issues they mobilize around. But the strategy is to identify leaders in the community. So if you're talking about people that are leaders of Black clubs, or people that are leaders of local unions, people that are leaders of religious congregations, to identify these people so that they can put organizers in touch with people that live in the communities, so they can figure out what do people care about. Because the idea, and this is connected to voting as well, what they want to do is to empower people with the ability to push legislators to actually legislate on their behalf and give people a reason to vote. So part of what Moses does as well is voter mobilization. That's part of what they do in chapters around the country. They're doing the same thing. But part of voter mobilization is not just vote because it's your civic duty. It is your civic duty to vote, but vote for people that are actually going to legislate on their behalf. And not just vote for the president or Congress. It's the prosecutor's office as well. You should be concerned about that. So these are, probably in the words of Calvin Morris, indigenous organizations. That's the idea. The idea is from the power to come from the bottom up. The organizer's idea is just to organize power. That's the idea. You do have a coordinating body called the Gamaliel Foundation, which is located in Chicago, which attempts to try to identify what areas of the country would be feasible to organize another chapter so we can push legislators in that area to pass legislation that helps working class and poor folks. So you do have some in the Great Plains. On the West Coast, they're interested in issues of immigration. In the South and Texas, they're interested in issues of immigration. In Detroit, for example, when I went to Lansing, there was a group, they weren't from, I don't know where they were from, I think they were from Chicago, no. They weren't from Detroit, they were from another city, but they wanted to push their state legislators to take a position on providing driver licenses for undocumented migrants. Because the argument was that, these people are trying to support their families, they also pay taxes, they're contributing citizens to our state, and so they should be allowed to work. Now for folks, for African Americans in Detroit, that was not the #1 issue on the agenda, but the idea is to link the issues that people in Detroit care about versus to the issues that people outside of Detroit care about. So to build power, that's the idea. But these are all indigenous-based organizations, ideas that the power comes from the bottom up.
So, I think, I'm wondering if I missed it.
Sure.
This kind of question about religious organizations and LGBTQ.
Yeah.
I went to surprise black churches.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of this hostility, and also
Yeah.
with the women and kind of the relegation, the submission of the role of women in the church.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a good question. These are, I guess you would say, fairly atypical, the average religious congregation. The average religious congregation is not going to weekly meetings or monthly meetings to talk about water affordability rates. These are clergy that see their activism connected to their faith. And so, social justice activism connected to the faith, human rights activism connected to the faith. So in the meeting that I've attended, women are in leadership positions. The executive director of Moses is a woman, and she has women on her staff and men on her staff, and the clergy that work with her in the organization, these men and women are in leadership positions. So they don't take a position on that, at least as far as I can tell from my observation and looking at the organization. Now they don't focus on issues of abortion, they don't focus on issues of same-sex marriage, they don't focus on, I guess, sexuality issues, they don't focus on those issues at all. They focus on quality of life issues. I mean, jobs, schools, public safety, water affordability, environmental justice. And the issues that they're mobilizing around are coming from where they are. It's coming from where they are. So, Consuela Hardaway, the executive director of Moses, her job is not to go to a meeting in the east side of Detroit and say, this is what we're going to do. Her job is to go to a meeting in the east side of Detroit and to listen, to understand what are people concerned about, and what have you tried, and who are the elected officials or people in government positions that we can target, and who is the organized opposition? What's the organized interest group that would make it difficult for us to achieve our goals? So for these types of groups, they're small. I mean, you have 200, roughly 3,500 congregations are connected to these types of groups, which is about 1%. Congregation. I mean, connected, I mean, but active, which is like 1%. And in metropolitan Detroit, it's the same thing. So we don't get any conservative churches. Long story, there are no, I mean, they're not connected to the organization. There are no conservative African American churches, white churches, Hispanic churches. They're not connected to the organization because the goals conflict with, the goals would be, antithetical to one another. But the other issue, of course, is that, for probably that reason, they remain very small. So I think they need a public relations expert. So. Yeah.
I was just curious, given the history of the state, when it was a colony, when it historically had a high black population, even though 1860 was predominantly African American, made up the population of this state. Has Moses given any thought to organizing here as like what does that look like if it has? Again, just thinking even just presidential election, like The state really matters
Right.
every 4 years,
Right.
right? But it's like we matter every day.
Right.
So I'm just curious.
No, that's a great question. So this is a map of faith-based community organizing firms connected to this group called Gamaliel Foundation. It's kind of akin to the Gamaliel Foundation is a local movement center. All right? And they work with smaller organizations like Moses. So one task of the Gamaliel Foundation is to find other metropolitan areas that would be conducive to them opening a chapter. There has to be interest, wherever they're located. So if there's interest in these areas, then they would open up a chapter. No, this is not the only type of organization. We also have this group called PICO. I can't remember what the acronym, but they are another faith-based community organizing firm that operates on the West Coast and Southwest. Most of their chapters are in California and Texas. And then you also have a smaller group called Clergy and Laity. I can't remember. It's a group in Los Angeles that mobilizes people who work in the service industry, particularly folks who work in hotels. And their idea is to try to encourage them and help them form a union. So you have these types of groups around the country, and they all organize around the same model, that these are business-based organizations. So if there was an interest in a region, they would. But it does a lot of work. I mean, I think nobody asked me about this, but I'm thinking about this. I want to talk about it. I was thinking about the difference between. Let's get to class. You mentioned class. The difference between my father-in-law and me being involved. He was involved in voting rights activity in the 1960s, and me just recently getting involved with Moses. The difference between him and me is that what he was advocating for would directly help him right then and there. And so people had a direct self-interest to go and stay involved. That's really not my situation here. I'm going because I think it's the right thing to do. But I can pay for my water. Mass transit works perfectly fine where I am. We don't have an issue of crime or underfunded schools in Ann Arbor. It's not an issue for me. But I'm involved because I think it's the right thing to do. And for me, it is part of my religious trajectory, my ideals of what it means to be a good human being, based on my understanding of my connection to the Creator. But if I don't go to another meeting, I will be fine, personally. My material condition won't change. That's difficult for Moses. That's difficult because the people they're attempting to mobilize are people like me, and they're also attempting to mobilize people that are directly impacted by the issues that they are mobilizing around, but they have very difficult, time-consuming lives that make it difficult for them to get involved and stay involved. That's a huge challenge. That's a huge challenge.
Hey, Teresa, could I ask a question?
No.
So
He hired me, so. I'm gonna let you ask a question.
I get to do it because I invited everybody here. No, I guess I want to play devil's advocate a little bit. And I'm trying to think, Khari, I heard your talk, and at the beginning I was thinking, man, life's so good. Why are we even here? And then there was a little turn, right? Wasn't a big turn though. And I can imagine that there would be a lot of folks who'd be saying, you're talking about small things, and the low-hanging fruit has been picked already. And we still have deep, deep problems that have more to do, not just with economics, not just with political power, but with racism itself, and the fact that, there's still people out there that hate me for the color of my skin. So, is Moses really the answer to that? I mean, I kind of That's great.
Yeah.
That's great, but
Right.
is that it, or is there more? And anybody can answer that. You know.
Well, I'll take first attempt. When Moses is confronting the issue of racism, is exactly what we're talking about. Let's take the issue of mass transit right now. In metropolitan Detroit, one issue is that many of the service jobs are outside of the city. People that are working at the service jobs, African Americans in the city, and trying to get to where the jobs are. And of course, we do not have a coordinated regional transit system to make it very easy for people to go from the city to the suburbs to where the jobs are. And it seemed like it would be, super easy for county commissioners to get on board with this and put the funding together to create a mass transit system that connects the dots between Ann Arbor to Detroit and all the areas in between. But of course, one of the big issues with funding is racial fears. The issue is that, well, if you have a mass transit system, then black folks from Detroit are going to go to Ann Arbor and they're going to rob people. So that's what they're confronting. And then, of course, but the other issue that's in front of me as well is, I don't want to pay for that.
Yeah.
I don't want my taxes to go up. We're fine. I have a car and everything is, reasonably, close to where I live. So those lazy folks in Detroit, they need to figure it out. So, I mean, the issues, even though they're not explicitly racial issues, these are all racial issues that they're dealing with. If it's mass transit, if it's water affordability, if it's police surveillance, the difficulty they have, for example, right now, I'm talking to class about it, but so the issue of single-payer health care. So right now, Moses is there are legislators in the state of Michigan that have sponsored a single-payer health care bill. And we have a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor, and it would seem that it would be, slam dunk for it to happen. But again, one of the difficulties is that the group that will disproportionately win from this would be poor African Americans. And so the challenge that most groups like Moses face is to convince everyone that, okay, if we fund a mass transit system, if we reform the healthcare system such that everyone can benefit, that we're not going to lose. So racism is an issue. I mean, that's an issue that makes it difficult for them to actually get traction on a lot of issues. But the other thing I would say is that they're the only group out there. I mean, they're the only group that's organizing people within the city and outside the city to talk about these issues. It would be great if there were other organizations that were working and then, had a bigger membership and had a larger funding base. It'd be great. But they're not.
So I would love to chime in, and this is really just amplifying a lot of what you've said, and so, but just kind of underscoring it in a different way, like, now, like, we're in this moment where people don't want to use terms like structural racism, but when we think about the work that Moses is dealing with, that's the term. And so this concept, like the Black experience in America, we've had all this progress. I think we've had a lot of progress on things like how much racial animus, like in terms of I am thinking about I want to be racist interpersonally against a human being. We've had a lot of progress there, and I think that accounts for some of those numbers. But structural racism, so the fact who has to pay for water, the whole situation of Detroit, where I have families, I spend a lot of time there, and it's like, who did the Great Migration, like I'm part of this, context from South Carolina, and like, so structural racism is the problem. And so when I think about what it means to use the term Black Lives Matter, what it means for Black Lives to Matter means to have health care and safety and access to good schools, all of these, water, obviously health. Like, I think, so a couple of other just quick points on that. So I'm thinking now about the work of Arlene Geronimus, who is a sociologist who writes about the concept of weathering. And in that, she's talking about the way, Black people's physical bodies are deeply impacted by racism. Not just the like, I hate you and I don't want you to be here racism, but structural racism. It's something I feel like I'm older than I should be, like in my body because of this. And that is the type of racism it feels like Moses is advocating against. And then just quickly, how we even think about notions of civil rights. So I'm thinking about a very recent book by Dylan Penningroth, who's an amazing historian. Just heard us talk and I immediately went to go buy this book. Talking about what civil rights has historically meant to Black people. And when we talk about civil rights, it's always about like the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, like all these things that I think are great and that I have focused on. But when you think about what people were really advocating for early on, it's like rights to contract, rights to be treated fairly in the workplace, just these like basic human rights. And that is what civil rights is. And so I actually think the freedom struggle totally incorporates the work of organizations like Moses alongside the work that we hear about in a more popular sense, like various Black Lives Matter organizations and prison abolition, etc.
I just personally perfect. All I want to say is as a historian, that's something that I'm trying to be very, and not just me, people like Kate Master, who's at Northwestern, like Hillary Green at Davidson College, is that's why I'm very intentional in saying the modern civil rights movement. For me, it's about putting respect on that the people before that we are standing on their shoulders, right? So even if we talk, and I love Rosa, to be clear, but Rosa is part of a long history of Black women doing sit-in demonstrations, even in this state during Reconstruction, right? And having the privilege of listening to Fred Gray do his talk, and I didn't know that there were 4 young women who did a sit-in in that same area prior to Rosa, and he said that the Black community wasn't ready, which I was but just to me, it's even thinking about going to Jennifer Morgan's work on West African women and the demands to take control of their bodies even in enslavement, right? And to be seen as human beings and not commodified as property. This to me is all part of that conversation. But even if we're talking in modern context, I had to tell my relatives this one day when they were like, "Oh, congratulations, you got your Ph.D." I said, "I'm still Black." At the end of the day, and I say that with pride, to be clear, but my titles mean nothing when I'm in a car. My wife is not Black, and we've been together for years, and she now knows when we're out, I'm like, "There's a cop." She's like, "Why do you always say that?" I was like, "Because I have no choice. I have to know where they're at and exactly how to respond, and to always be on my guard." And when we talked about having a child, that I had to be very clear, I have to prepare to have that talk with her. And I'm dreaded that I have to tell my child, here's what you don't do, here's what you don't, because that's what my parents did. Right? That's the reality of we have to also acknowledge the unfair responsibilities that people of color and their allies have to do to continue to inform them of not only realities now, but the history with it. And that's, for me, it's understanding history, even if you don't want to study history, which is fine, is knowing when we talk about systemic racism, people throw out these terms all the time. And I'm like, okay, well, you should go read Kate Master's book, where she makes it very clear that the founding of the police system in this country was inherently anti-Black from the beginning. Even if you want to go to the Scottsboro 9, right? To me, it's we need people of color, or at least their allies, to be educated, so those young men are not dead to rights when they're in that court. Because for me, when I was teaching that, I paused and I showed a picture, and how would you feel knowing this case is done before you walk in the room? And so it's that kind of reality that I'm trying to instill in my students, to just know, one, your history, to be able to shut down so many of these arguments, when someone says states' rights, right? And I'm just if you just ask them, what do you mean? Because it's just
now, I want to give a
sorry.
their time.
So they have 15 minutes. I got I'm sorry.
I want to give you your time to ask questions of the panelists. So,
thank you all for coming here. This has been a really fascinating talk, and it also seems to incorporate a lot into one of the themes that we've seen throughout all of the Tocqueville lectures this year, which is Tocqueville's got his concept of the voluntary associations that are so prominent in America. But in the past several generations, we've seen, gradual, and then more so in the recent years, rapid decline in the sorts of voluntary associations in America. Moses seems like it's in the sort of mold of those sort of associations, but in a world where people are trusting those sorts of groups less, trusting institutions less, what are the paths towards this sort of, advocating for rights that you're talking about, working against these structural racisms that can come about without utilizing these? Or is there any chance of doing it in the sort of modern framework of not trusting those sorts of voluntary associations?
I mean, it's an uphill battle because it's not just religious congregations that have lost membership, but all voluntary associations have lost membership, including unions. Moses mobilizes through congregations who've lost a considerable amount of attendees and money over time, and labor unions as well. I mean, in Michigan, our state passed a right to work law, which the law stated that people can now, if you're employed by an employer where they have unions, you don't automatically have to join. So you can, if you say, I'm good, I'm at Wayne State, we have a faculty union, I don't want to pay, I can keep my money, of course, that weakens the union. And so for groups like Moses, it's very increasingly difficult for them to actually find organizations where they can identify leaders and determine who are the community, people in the community that they can talk to. So that's tough. And these are structural issues that are outside of the purview of any one organization. But I mean, one of the goals of Moses, in addition to actually trying to empower community leaders and change legislation, is to, well, part of the goal, in addition to actually trying to bring about policy change on these issues that directly connected to structural racism, why are African Americans disproportionately in medical debt? Why are African Americans disproportionately unable to pay their health care bills? Why are African Americans disproportionately in schools that are underperforming, that have been taken over by the state? So these are all issues of structural racism issues. So one of the tasks that Moses is attempting always works on is raising public consciousness, to make people aware that these issues that are confronting them, issues of public safety, public health, and safe water, and public transportation, that it's not because you're a bad person, or you're lazy, or you have some type of moral qualm you need to deal with. You're a human being, and there are ways in which you can organize power in your neighborhood, your block club, your union, your religious congregation to try to bring about change. But I mean, the only thing that they are able to do is to continue to work, is to continue to mobilize. I mean, to me, let me just make this point, then I'll stop. Last point. It is important that to me, when I think about this rationally, that it's no accident that these types of groups are faith-based groups. Because if you're an empirical person, you say, this is worse, this is pointless to be involved. We're not going to win on these issues. Some of these issues, like for example, single-payer health care, the private health insurance industry in Michigan doesn't want it. The bill that the state legislature co-sponsored to create a single-payer health care has been in committee since July, and they have not voted on it, which means it will likely die in committee. Now, if you're a rational person, you would say, this is ridiculous, I'm wasting my time. So I think one of the reasons why people like Moses, groups like Moses participate is because they have a longer vision of this idea of justice. All right, so that if it doesn't work out in 2023, maybe next year, or 10 years from now, or 30 years from now, or 50 years from now. But I think it is this connection to this higher power, this universal ideal that they will at some point get closer to this ideal of truth. So I'll stop there. Okay, done.
Well, thank you all for being here. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt I don't mean to interrupt Dr. Brown.
Sure.
Very wise. You are. So my question, I'm a student here, my name is Noah. My question concerns with racial gerrymandering, which is a problem now. I mean, it dilutes the power of, it's used in some ways, legislatures are using it now. It dilutes the power of African Americans to choose their candidate of their choice. And although there have been, the Voting Rights Act has prevailed in, say, Alabama, there are still other challenges in Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and there are even more concerns now. In my home state of North Carolina, the General Assembly recently passed a heavily skewed map that some say amounts to racial gerrymandering. And even in this state, in South Carolina, they tried to defend this state's map in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And unfortunately, it looks likely to prevail. The U.S. Supreme Court is likely to keep that map in place, while also undermining and curtailing the Equal Protection Clause based on, through their decision. So, given the fight is not over, obviously, what lessons could Tocqueville offer on racial gerrymandering to deal with it?
I'm racial gerrymandering.
If anybody on the panel
Oh,
can
sorry.
help.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, we got the political science. Andrew. Go for it.
Okay, there's a lot there. Thank you for all of that. I think some of the things that have been surprising in the last couple of years is that after Brnovich, I think everybody was kind of bracing for the fact that the Supreme Court might not use Section 2 to invalidate obvious racial gerrymandering. And so it was actually somewhat surprising to see the outcome of the Alabama case and even the things that we've seen kind of coming up in the district courts in Louisiana and in Georgia, and even in North Carolina as well. There are some people who speculate. I was on a panel on Friday, kind of where we were talking about this, that there may have been some strategy there. Chief Justice Roberts saying we'll need this stuff here because we're getting ready to take away affirmative action in college admissions. So like we want to balance how mad people are going to be about a number of things. You know, the thing that is challenging about the South, so I have to admit, like when I saw what happened in Alabama, so there was the ruling itself, and then there was the, y'all don't have enforcement capabilities, so screw y'all, we're not gonna do anything until we have to go back to court type of situation. I was like, wow, you're just making my lessons for me about sort of like what the weaknesses of courts are. Thank y'all for explaining this so that people can see this in real time. There are some, the challenge in the South is the high correlation between race and partisanship. So sometimes people are like, well, we were gerrymandering on race, we were gerrymandering on party, which is perfectly legal. Like the Supreme Court has said, you know, looking at cases in Ohio, and I think it's Ohio and Maryland, if I recall, like where they came up that, hey, you can gerrymander on party all you want. When it is heavily correlated with race, it's just a question of, is the court willing to see that? And so it's kind of obvious in states like Louisiana and Alabama in particular, where you got like 30% of the population is black, but only like 1/6 of the seats are held by African Americans, where people are like, where blacks are having the opportunity to exercise their choice and be pivotal in electing representatives of their choice, especially given the fact that residential segregation still persists, right? If people were evenly distributed across the state, we couldn't really have this type of argument, but because of residential segregation, you have these population centers of blacks. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen in Georgia. So the issue in Georgia was that there was a lot of interesting packing and cracking going on. So it's not a proportionality question per se. In the state, because if we looked at 14 congressional seats, 5 of which are held by African Americans and about 30% of the electorate is black. But what they did in the sort of Atlanta suburbs is that like there were the 2 really black seats that like were not going to get touched at all by this. So the 4th district and the 5th district. So Atlanta and DeKalb County. And then there are some of the sort of remaining districts. So if you go to the 7th district, it's actually a multiracial district. There is no clear racial majority. It's not quite equal, but it's almost equal proportions of blacks, whites, Latinos, and Asian Americans in that district. Next door in the 6th district, so it used to be Newt Gingrich's seat, increasingly you see more people of color moving into the district because it's cheaper to live there than it would be to kind of live inside the 285 perimeter and sort of inside the city center. And then you have the 11th district, which is South Metro, which is another place where a lot of black people ended up living. And so what ended up happening with the redistricting was they took some people out of the 11th district in Cobb County. They put them in the 14th district. So you went from having a black congressman, David Scott, to moving into Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. Right? So then you took people of color in the 6th district, which was at the time represented by So you have not a majority black district, but now you're taking a majority minority district and you're making it even more majority minority. So that district was competitive, and a white Democrat, Carolyn Bordeaux, won it, and now you guaranteed that a Democrat's gonna take the district, right? It ended up not being Carolyn Bordeaux. Lucy McBath saw the numbers and was like, I can't win in the 6th district, which is now, because we moved out people of color who are Democrats, it's now whiter and more Republican. So I'm just gonna go run over in the 7th district, and because of the racial sort of dynamics of this district being majority minority, right? Black Democrat can beat white Democrat real easy. Right, I mean, and there's some interesting ways about how she claimed to kind of be more progressive, even though she wasn't actually more progressive than Carolyn Bordeaux, but just by being black, right, people believed it more. And so it's an interesting, right, is that traditional packing and cracking. And so far, like the district court has said, yes, we see this and we don't agree. And this General Assembly, which is not a supermajority Republican General Assembly, right? Looks like we'll see kind of how they end up kind of complying with the district. They're probably not going to give a middle finger back to the Supreme Court like Alabama did, right? The governor doesn't seem to be inclined to do that. He called the special session, he talked about redrawing the lines, but we're going to see like what those districts, like district compositions kind of end up looking like. But they are going to try to protect their seats as much as possible. But the challenge is, especially when it gets down to looking at the state legislative seats, is that especially in Metro Atlanta, you can't ignore the fact that black people now live in suburban areas where they didn't used to live, right? You cannot gerrymander sort of like people of color out of the equation in Cobb County and in Gwinnett County. There are just too many of them there to be able to credibly do it. So there are lots of challenges with that, but a big challenge is coming up with an agreed upon principle that one recognizes that sometimes things that are passing themselves off as racially neutral are in fact not. And then there's this larger structural problem of partisan gerrymandering is a problem, but the Supreme Court has said hands off to that.
Thank you very much. If you want to hear more about this, Dr. Gillespie and Dr. Bell are speaking tomorrow night, and the synergy will grow. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Let's give our